Paranormal Experienced with Kat Hobson covers paranormal experiences, haunted locations and their histories, high strangeness, including cryptozoology, ufologists, psychics, mediums, authors, and media personalities. Join her as she seeks to bring light to those things that exist by hiding in the dark. Now, here's your host, Paranormal Experienced, the intrepid Kat Hobson.
Hello there. Hello there. I am so glad you're joining me tonight. You know, I always think that all of our shows are the best shows, and they are. But tonight I get to welcome someone that I've interviewed before. I enjoyed them so much, and he is flying solo tonight. His wife Jaci is working, but I'm here to tell you that you're going to enjoy this man's information. It is Bill Kousoulas, who is a PhD, and he is someone who studies the positive out of tragedy. He is, talk about intrepid. I mean, the way that he covered the Silver Bridge collapse in Point Pleasant was amazing to me. And to be able to go to a situation like that, research it, work on it, take your team down to investigate it, and you know, there you are, you've got a way to pull positive experiences from something that looked like just such a complete and utter tragedy. You know, we've had that happen in other places in our country's history. And we're probably going to touch on that too, because this is the guy for it. I'm not kidding. So welcome, Dr. Bill Kousoulas.
Good evening, Kat. How are you?
I'm fine. That's the first time I've called you, doctor.
Yeah, it can be the last if you want, because I don't usually use it, but it's nice. Thank you.
Well, my dad worked very hard for his PhD because it's not something that you get easily. And so I feel like people should be honored with that at least once in their day.
Well, thank you. It is nice to hear it.
Well, I'm glad.
That.
You know, do you want to tell people a little bit about what your thesis was, what your dissertation was? Because I think that what you've studied, what you wrote about, and what you've done with the Mothman situation, the Silver Bridge collapse, is such a strong reflection of the person you are. Would you mind sharing some about your positivity theories?
Absolutely. So for me, I guess it began prior to graduate school. I went to graduate school later in life. I was in my 40s when I decided to go back to school after a successful career in sales, and enjoyed what I was doing, but wasn't feeling totally fulfilled. Now, my first marriage ended in divorce, and it was a very strange situation. I was married for 3 years. The divorce took twice as long, and we had no kids and no real estate. But I took a legal battering in the court system, and what I found was that when you take a step forward in the process, you take 2 steps back. And so going through all of that, they say that what doesn't kill you will make you stronger. And I learned resilience, I learned patience, I learned faith, I learned all kinds of different things. And at the end of it, I figured I'd just put it behind me and move on. So Jackie and I met, we began dating, we got married. We've been together now for just a little shy of 20 years. But when I decided to go back to school at the age of 43, I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I was just going to study and see where the course went. Now, my bachelor's is in English, but I was always passionate about psychology. So I started studying psychology, really business-oriented psychology, or what's known as industrial organizational. But as the path continued to develop and my career kept on going, but up and down while I was working on the education, by the time I got to the doctoral level, Then my dissertation committee wanted me to have research questions that were really, really laser focused. So originally what I wanted to do was to study post-traumatic growth, which is some of the good things that we don't necessarily expect when we go through trauma. And traditionally, trauma in post-traumatic growth had been studied in the way of sudden death of a loved one, maybe an earthquake, maybe a hurricane, mass casualty, unexpected circumstances that really, really hit home. But as I worked with my research committee, they said, Bill, you want to do this thing about post-traumatic growth in a major life crisis. That's not really focused enough. And of course, I resisted that because I thought I was ready to go. Let's get this whole thing going. They said, no, we don't care what you think because this is what we think. And we know
They don't care what you think, do they?
No, they
They're
don't.
just there to judge you every 6 Wednesday, Sunday. Yeah.
Exactly. So what we ended up landing on was, what are the dimensions of post-traumatic growth that a man can go through by experiencing divorce in his 30s and or 40s, which was exactly what happened to me. Mm-hmm. So that gave me the question that they wanted. And then I recruited 9 individuals, 9 men, and we interviewed them and we focused on the positive things that came from their divorce processes. And what was really interesting, Kat, was that a lot of these guys had never really stopped and thought about what they gained by going through the divorce process. Because you hear so much people talk about, I went through a divorce and that so-and-so ruined my life, whether she did, he did, whatever the case is. Yes. But if you flip that around and learn from what happened, you can use that difficult challenge or even trauma, and you can turn it into a springboard to get to levels in life you've not accomplished before. So that's what my dissertation was about. As soon as I graduated with the doctorate, within weeks, we spun up our research plan to be able to look at post-traumatic growth in light of the Silver Bridge disaster of 1966 and 1967. Because when the Mothman Prophecies movie was released, it caught my attention. And then I bought the book, The Mothman Prophecies by John Keel. And I got my hands on everything I possibly could that Keel wrote and other related authors as well. So we put a research plan together to look at the Silver Bridge disaster as well as Mothman and the things that happened in the 60s. And that's how we got that project rolling.
It's really interesting because, I'm also the host of Fate Magazine Radio. And my very first Fate show was with the director of the Mothman Museum.
Jeff Wamsley.
Yes.
He's a friend of mine.
Well, he's a wonderful man.
Wonderful guy.
I had the best time with him because I was not very well versed in this. And I love research. I love to research. I'm a nerd, and that's a good thing for what I do. But, it's just so much fun to go. And then when I saw your book, initially when we first met, I was like, holy cow, this is going to be great. And it was. So that was a toughie to be able to get the positives initially, I would think. But, let's touch where you started on that. How did you ascertain, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is going to be great.
Well, what was interesting is that Jaci and I started traveling to Point Pleasant back in 2016. And at that point, I was really pretty new at the doctoral level. I'd finished my master's in 2014, and I was just kind of getting my legs under me in the doctoral program. And it was hard. I mean, it was so much work. And Jaci was a full-time postmaster at the time, and she was building a couple of her own businesses. And I was a full-time sales professional, and I was working on my doctorate. And we just didn't have a lot of time for each other. So we decided we better take a vacation before we were totally disconnected. Right. And we decided, Jaci said, where do you want to go? And I said, let's go to Point Pleasant. And she kind of looked at me and she's like, okay.
You romantic devil, you. Yes.
Right. Because usually when we took vacations, it's like San Diego or Puerto Vallarta or someplace that's a little bit more exotic. But because I was warm. Yeah, that too. Well, Point Pleasant is warm, but not tropical, So we went out to Point Pleasant, and the very first person we met in Point Pleasant was a lady by the name of Carolyn Harris. And we didn't know who Carolyn was at first, but within a few minutes, she told us that she and Jeff Wamsley, who runs the Mothman Museum, were the co-founders of the Mothman Festival. And then I said, you kind of look familiar to me. Have I seen you on TV? And she said, yeah, I've been in 16 or 17 documentaries. And she blushed. She was just a sweet little old lady. She's very humble, very kind, had a servant's heart. And we found out a few minutes later that she would not want to discuss the Silver Bridge disaster because she lost her 2-year-old son with his father in the Silver Bridge disaster. So immediately within 15, 20 minutes of meeting this lady who really made us feel like we were at home, we felt an overwhelming sense of duty and compassion for her. And over the course of the next few days, we stopped into her restaurant every day. We went to the museum, we went to the TNT area, we investigated Point Pleasant as best we could, but we just fell in love with Carolyn. Now we went back into our lives and back into work, and I felt like I had a mountaintop type experience by being to Point Pleasant. And at that point, I had to get back into work. I had to get back into school. We had to get back into raising our granddaughter. We had all kinds of stuff going on. But in December, on the way to my mother-in-law's for Christmas Eve, I told Jackie, I said, you know what? I think I'm going to contact Carolyn. That's my dog sneezing in the background. You okay?
That's okay. We have discussed, he has labs. He has multiple labs. So, as you know, my beasties sometimes make their appearances. So his are going to be, letting us know they're hanging out with Dad.
Yep. So what I was saying before Ellie started sneezing is that I told Jackie I wanted to call Carolyn, and she said, that's great, but this is Christmas Eve. Let's wait till after the holidays. So we got to my mother-in-law's house. We had our dinner, and then we drove home that night. And the next morning, our friend Mark Griffith, who was our first interview in Bridging the Tragedy, he sent us a message on Facebook, and he said, hey, Carolyn had a heart attack. And the next day, Carolyn passed away. So we never got a chance to see her again, and we were just crushed. But that was kind of the beginning for us of realizing we really needed to do something with this whole Point Pleasant thing, this legend, this mystery, this tragedy. And so over the course of the next few years, it just kind of percolated with us while we went about our lives. We traveled back to Point Pleasant every year after that through 2021. And in 2021, when I finally graduated, within a few days, we generated the study and we dedicated it to Carolyn Harris.
Yeah. As you should. That's so beautiful. It's just one of those things that speaks volumes about the people y'all are. So.
Well, we found a home in Point Pleasant. What we found out, Kat, was that the people like Carolyn and like Mark Griffith and Jeff Wamsley, when we first met them, treated us like we were really something special. And I know it wasn't just us that they treated that way. They're just very welcoming people. And that resonated with us. Every time we went back to Point Pleasant for the next 5 years, we made more friends. And these people really became like extended family for us. So it was a natural extension of those relationships we were able to be a part of that led us to what we ended up doing with that project.
Had you already formed Phenomenology Research Professionals before your initial visit?
No. As a matter of fact, we weren't quite sure how we were going to kick this project off. It was really interesting the way that Phenomenology Research Professionals began, because in 2020, we drove to Point Pleasant during COVID, and we decided we're going to go out there anyway. And we met a guy by the name of Steve Ward. And I don't know if you know who Steve is or not, but he's a self-professed information jockey of the Mothman Museum now. And he's a fun guy. He's a lot of fun. We became friends, and he wanted to interview us on his Paranormal UK program. And so at that point, we thought, well, we better get our act together and make it look like we're worthy of being on his show. So at that point, we spun up the name and we began going with that. And we interviewed with Steve, and things started developing forward from that point. So he was instrumental in getting us to take our ideas from inception into practice, if that makes sense. He got us along that path. So it was 2020, 2021 when we really started kind of coming into our own with that.
Well, it's I like the phenomenology term versus paranormal, anomalous, whatever, because it covers everything. It truly does. And I know that's what you were shooting for, isn't it?
Well, it really is, because I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to take my career after we finished the doctorate, but
Yes.
because I could meld the research skills that I had developed over the years in 10 years in graduate school and couple that with a passion for the paranormal, because I've been interested in the paranormal
Yes.
since I was a little guy. And we could look at psychology, we can look at parapsychology, we can look at all these anomalous phenomena, but we can also focus on phenomena that's not anomalous, phenomena like a bridge collapse, phenomena like we all experience on a daily basis, and really examine that in a way that brings light to what's really going on beneath the surface, and still to focus on the positive things that we can take from our experiences.
Absolutely. And, it's really when people, start hearing paranormal, um, all that is just something that's anomalous, something that is not normal. And there's so many connotations that go with that. I feel like there are. I'm a paranormal researcher. I'm also a noetic sciences researcher. I'm I have all kinds of things that I fall under, right? But so many people, if they don't know, are like, oh, she's a paranormal researcher. She's a ghost hunter, or whatever term of the week that is. But there's so much different information to be found on so many varied topics that I you found just about all of that when you were in Point Pleasant, didn't you? Mount Pleasant.
Well, life is fascinating, and to be able to look at it objectively and take a look at what's happening both with our eyes and our senses, but also with our hearts and our feelings and our perceptions and all these things, and then look at things collectively and try to figure out what's going on, or really just enjoy the ride, so to speak.
Yeah,
I
me
think it's
too.
important to keep an open mind. I like to approach things in a way that keeps the sense of wonder alive, because
Yes.
we're never going to know everything. I don't care how smart we think we are. We're just never going to know everything. But we have the opportunity to continue to learn and to grow and to develop. And this world around us is so much more comprehensive than we can ever really define. So, yeah, I mean, for me,
Yeah.
it's just such an exciting time in our world right now, but to investigate things that happened throughout history or that might be right in front of us now, and to look at them objectively and to try to bring some type of sense to them, it's a challenge, and it's just a lot of fun. It's very rewarding.
It is. And, you're talking about in our times now, there's so much that is coming to light, in various sciences or, subsciences, that type of thing. Look at the stuff with ufology. I truly never thought that I would be leaving contact in the desert and getting on a plane as they're breaking the congressional hearings that, yes, we do have biologics. Really? Right?
Mhm.
I mean, things of that nature aren't supposed to just randomly happen, right? And they are left and right. And, who would have ever thought that there would be so many paranormal television shows that you can't throw a rock and not hit an investigator?
Oh yeah.
And not that I would throw rocks at them because I am one, but I mean, the 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 hidden topics are becoming mainstream.
They really are. And it's interesting that you bring that up. I was on a Zoom call Sunday night with Grant Cameron, and
Love him.
we had just met, and I'm familiar with him from the research community and from his appearances on television programs and the contributions he's made to our field, but we'd
They
never
are
talked
legion.
before. I
Yeah.
let him know, I sent him a message and sent him our research plan for our next book, and said, hey, we'd be interested in talking to you if you'd like to talk to us. And he got back to me really pretty quickly, and he said yes. And so I sent him a Zoom invite, and we got together and we visited for 75 to 80 minutes on Sunday night, and I had a hard time getting a word in edgewise. He went on and on and on and told me about all the things he's been investigating and what his thoughts are. And one of the interesting points that he made, which really kind of resonates with what you just said, was that for the last few decades, we've been getting little bits and pieces of information dropped off through the media.
Yes.
Like, and he mentioned Close Encounters of the First Kind. And I wasn't aware of this, but he said, that's legit. That actually really happened. Spielberg packaged it up and sold it as a movie, but this actually really happened. And so as he talked about the way this has been happening systematically through the media, I found that to be really fascinating. Not that I've thought otherwise, but to hear a seasoned researcher such as him, who's been in the field for decades, say that, it just really resonated with me.
Well, I got to interview one of the guys who was in that movie, Jacques Vallée.
Yeah.
And he was so excited by that. For the same reason. And it was a lot of fun to talk to him. But because he did have Spielberg put him in it. And he was the tall man as they're coming off the craft. The other people are coming in.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, he was portrayed as French. What do you think?
Well, go figure. I guess, it'd be easy
Typecasting.
Yep.
But they're all of the people who have been fighting for this, we've had disclosure. They want in writing, but we have that. But they want something more specific. And it's really hard. And you know this because you are a logic-based human being. It's really hard for a government to come to their people and say, gee, we're so sorry, but we have been working with other people who just wanted to research on some of us. And so some of those people that are missing, we might know where they went. And we've been hiding all of this because, Kurt Russell did report those Phoenix lights, and so did everybody else, but balloons. I mean, how does the government come back from that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And as you were saying what you just said, I was thinking, in America, because I'm American, and I'm sure this goes for other countries as well, we have such a wide citizenship. People with different levels of beliefs, different levels of education, different levels of understanding, and really tolerance. I've got a lot of tolerance for ambiguity. Not everybody does. I like to operate, in abstraction more than I do in practical stuff. But how do you sell a concept to an American people or to a Canadian people or wherever that we've been systematically disclosing this to you guys, but at the same point in time holding our cards to the vest because we know it's not good for you, without being condescending and without being untrustworthy as an organization, our government. So I don't know. Maybe they're doing the best they can to help us understand this stuff, protect us from it. I don't know.
Well, I don't think they're doing a very good job of protecting from it unless, well, let me rephrase that. I do think that as far as masses go, perhaps they are doing a good job of protecting us. But there are a lot of people, individuals, some of whom I've spoken with, who feel that they weren't protected in the least and that they were kind of sacrificed for goodie bags unknown. It's a tough gig. If you were in the government, I know that there were people who were drawn up during those hearings because I heard some of what was coming out in those hearings prior to them. And it's just, how do you take your populace forward and hope to have trust?
It's a great question.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of mistrust in the government. I mean, there just really is. At this stage of things, have we gone too far that we can never really recover from that? I don't know. I try to stay
There's no
positive and
telling.
optimistic, but then again, I don't get too involved with what's going on in the world of government. I stay focused on what I like to
Well, I
study.
like ufology, so
Well, yeah, that's
that's my part
fascinating.
of government.
Yep.
So, because if I look at the other stuff, then my blood pressure goes up, and I just can't do. Yeah, and I was a political science major. I find most of this stuff fascinating. I do not find what's happening now fascinating.
No, I don't either. It's
So
I don't
it's
know.
kind of alarming. It's kind of alarming, but because really and truly, there's not any easy answer for any of the situations that from ufology to politics to you know paranormal, and how do you ascertain what something is? Is it all tricks, mirrors and light, or is it all interaction with alien beings? I mean, nobody knows. There's so many different outlooks on things. But I do know, as you know, that there is intelligence behind a lot of the paranormal experiences that we have.
There really is, and for our next project, I've been doing a lot of background research because what we did with our first book was we came up with a literature review, and it really talked about the historical, we utilized historical sources about the Silver Bridge, about the Mothman, and things of that nature. But then we also went into the positive psychology databases, and we found all kinds of stuff that was based upon post-traumatic growth to see if we could find a good way to give us a background to what we needed to study. So in the meantime, one of the sources that I've been studying lately is George Hansen's Trickster in the Paranormal. Are you familiar with that book?
I am.
What a tough read that is.
Yes.
I got to tell you, when I was talking to Grant on Sunday night, I said, I've studied some pretty heavy topics over the years. I'm not a slouch, but this guy he's practically, he goes in so many different directions. I hate to say it's over my head, but in some ways it almost feels like it is. But the thing that he talked about and the concept that I've really grabbed onto that resonates with me is reflexivity. And John Keel talked about that too, without using the term reflexivity, but both of them, and Grant Cameron as well. And I have come to, I don't want to say believe or what have you, but I suspect that they're onto something. And that is that this phenomena is interactive. It's a co-creation between the way we perceive it and what we're putting out there, into the psi-plasma or whatever you want to call that. And then it reflects back to you along your belief systems and your thought processes and your cultural background and all these types of things. And
Absolutely.
really all three of them discuss that. And it's a fascinating study.
Well, that whole I think it's a probability. I don't think it's just a possibility, but because you get back what you anticipate most of the time. Case in point, if I am with people who are expecting everything that they come across to be demonic, there's not going to be a positive experience in the crowd. And so I don't go with those people if I know that's how they are. But by the same token, I love the opportunity to be with people who are open-minded, who just want to see what interaction can happen. And it's astounding what you get in that circumstance.
What you get back, what you expect.
Yes.
We get out of life what we put into life. And when Grant and I were talking on Sunday, he was talking about Ouija boards. He said, the connotation of Ouija boards is all negative. He said, but the guy who founded Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, he did Ouija board sessions, and he was channeling a 16th century monk who gave him a lot of the basis for the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. So,
which might be a little effective. I mean,
it seems to work. Yeah, it seems to work.
It does work.
But
I've seen it work.
I have too. And then he talked about if people go into the Ouija board sessions with fear, they're going to attract the negative energy. So
they're going to manifest it if they don't attract one that's really right there.
And it made sense to me. And although I've not done Ouija board sessions, we do spirit box sessions, which I think are 6 of one, half dozen
Electronic
of the
Ouija
other.
boards. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same thing. And when we've done our spirit box sessions, we've gotten some really fascinating data. But again, some of it's traveling along the lines of our expectations. Some of it's probably going out into the psi plasma and answering back with whatever spiritual forces might be there. And we get some tangible data that takes us someplace interesting. And we found
Yes.
this in Chicago. We found it in West Virginia. We've done them right on the banks of the Ohio River. And we've gotten some really interesting information that way. But again, we're both very positive people, and we don't feel like we have negative things following us home, which
Right.
is something I definitely don't want.
I had something show up at my home that somebody sent here, and that was enough. I got it taken care of, but I do not, and I'm very cautious with where I investigate now and what kind of day I'm having when I do it.
Are you saying like an attachment came your way? Somebody placed some type of a curse?
Somebody put a type of spirit into my home.
Oh boy,
Yes, that was not my friend.
that's really scary.
It was really scary. And what's so interesting, my research partner at that time was very, um, nah, there's no way. There's no way. There's no way that, don't believe in demons, barely believe in ghosts. If I hadn't had paranormal experiences, we wouldn't be doing this. Well, my husband was out of town and I called. I said, look, I have to do this and I need to do it now. Do you mind if I ask my partner to come and do this with me? And he was like, no, I don't mind. So that's what I did. And as we're starting the process, um, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing and I'm waiting on his response, and there's not one. And I just kind of turned around and said, you're supposed to say, you know, amen. You've got to cooperate with this. And it was just a minor rite. It wasn't like boom. But I felt like it was minor what was here. And come to find out at the end of the day, I was kind of picking on him about, you just completely lost focus. He was like, I saw what looked like a guy in a black morph suit. And I said, you what? Why didn't you say something? He said, because one of us had to stay focused. And that was, I think, a defining moment in his investigation research type thing, because now he is working towards the degrees that he needs to actually be a parapsychologist, a credentialed parapsychologist. And it was a transitional moment, and that's when I knew that it was actually real. Not that I would ever have doubted him. He's brilliant, and but he had a transformation through that experience that made him very serious about, okay, we're going hardcore, and he's been working on that for about 3 years now. So, and just so you know, his name is Frank Lee. If anybody, he used to do Paranormalities and Ponderings, the show. So this was somebody that's a very serious researcher, and for him to be so blown away to have had the experience that he had was, his reaction was kind of life altering for me, because I was like, okay, this was somebody that doesn't really believe in that aspect of things, yet there it was. And he was blown away because he could not explain that. And it didn't fit in with his mindset. I knew there was something there because I had experienced it.
Mm-hmm.
So, to me, that was mind blowing. And I did appreciate that he didn't tell me what he saw before we got through.
And I'm glad it's gone now.
Oh, yes. But that's another thing, is that this house felt so light. I hadn't realized it didn't, right? And when we got through, the house was so light. The air was so clean. Everything just felt fresh and new. And there really is a physical manifestation that goes to some hauntings and some experiences.
Mm-hmm. What you were talking about reminded me of an old friend of mine. He and I were talking once when I was at the very beginning stages of going through the divorce, and we were talking about how things had gotten bad, but you don't notice how bad they are until you
Yes.
get out of them. And he made the analogy that if somebody took a knife and stabbed you as hard as they could in the arm and left that knife there, at first it would really, really hurt. It would really get your attention. And then after a while, you wouldn't really feel it until they pushed it again. And he made that analogy about how, we hit levels or plateaus
Yes.
and they become normal to us. So as our new normal might be getting worse and worse and worse and worse, we don't notice it until it's all wiped away and we start with a clean slate again. Like you talked about, the house felt lighter once and I'm going to use the word exorcism, even though you didn't use that word, but once that
Right.
exorcism took place, or for me in my case, once the divorce was over, all of a sudden, hey,
They're kind of the same thing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Exercising a bad relationship with either a
Yes.
human being or a spiritual entity can be a similar type of experience. But yeah, I'm glad that that's done for you, and I'm glad with what I dealt with was over for me
Me
quite a
too.
while ago now.
Me too. Well, that is interesting that you correlated those because it is. And that was also a relationship I was glad to see end. So I, you know, the thing about the knife, yeah, that is so true. And that's like with any toxic relationship, they're just kind of such a release.
Yes.
So, well, you know, when you with your finding the positives and the negatives, that is that's such a hard thing sometimes. And the fact that you did your whole study on this just is overwhelming to me because I know there's so many different levels that that's applicable to. What was the one that you found most unusual
In terms of interviews,
in terms of interviews of people that have found a way to do that? Yeah.
so when we wrote Bridging the Tragedy and we interviewed the people that we interviewed there, trying to think who would come to mind. I think I always like to say that Jimmy Wedge was a guy who we interviewed, who, when he called me out of the article that was placed in the Point Pleasant Register and said, "Hey, I'd be interested in talking to you. I lost both my parents, in the Silver Bridge disaster." Well, when he told me that, I immediately was in a place of reverence because that's a huge, huge thing. I mean, to
Yes.
lose one parent would be devastating. To lose both,
Yes.
overwhelming. And so when we got that call and I told Jackie, I said, "Hey, you know what? Jimmy wants us to interview him, and he's lost both his mom and his dad. This is really making me feel a little uncomfortable, because I don't know how this is going to go." And so we went to Point Pleasant in July of 2021, and we started interviewing people. And we started with Mark Griffith, who was the guy that we met with Carolyn Harris on our first trip. We interviewed him. We interviewed a lady by the name of Susan Sayer, who works in the Mothman Museum and some of the Walmsley family's other businesses. And then Linda Lane, who I'll come back to her. But after we were done with those three, within the first couple days, we got down to some of the meat and potatoes of the book. And the reason I say that is because we knew Jimmy was coming, but the next interview that we had was with a guy by the name of Denny Bellamy. Denny Bellamy he's kind of an icon in Point Pleasant. He is the executive director of the Visitors and Convention Bureau, and he's been in all kinds of documentaries. Like he told us over 60 documentaries about Point Pleasant, about Mothman. And he said, "So you tell me you're interviewing Jimmy Wedge?" He said, Jimmy doesn't give interviews. Are you sure we're talking about the same guy? And he said, well, describe him. I said, well, we haven't met him yet. I don't know what he looks like. He says, well, I got to tell you, he never gives interviews. He lost both his mom and dad. He was the mayor of Point Pleasant, and he is a congressman now. So this is making the anxiety raise a little bit higher. Then we met Rick Hanley, who was referred to us by Mark Griffith. And Rick had the same things to say about him too. Now, we had lunch with Jeff Wamsley. So let me back up. We had lunch with Jeff before we interviewed Denny and Rick. And Jeff's been a friend of ours for 7 years by this point. And we told him we were going to be interviewing Jimmy Wedge. And Jeff said, who? And we said, Jimmy Wedge. He says, I know there's a JJ Wedge, but who are you talking about? He said, he doesn't give interviews. I said, well, he called me and he wants to interview. So Jeff was kind of like, that's interesting. So by the time we got to Jimmy, now we're hearing this guy is a legend and we're hearing all kinds of stuff about him. And he comes into the room and we know he's lost his mom and his dad. He was the biggest cut up in the entire process. He was hilarious. He was the funniest
How fun.
Well, yeah, it was a blast. You know, here we were going to have Jackie interview him instead of me because she was a government official also, and Jimmy was too. But then I just figured, you know what, I'll just do this. And we went ahead and we went through the process. But he told us all kinds of stories about some of his political endeavors and how he was a glad-handing type of politician. And he was, I have to, for people who haven't read the book, you got to read it for yourself.
Yeah.
It's so funny. But it just totally alleviated all of that anxiety that we had about interviewing a guy who lost his mom and dad. And as it turned out, he was the oldest person that we interviewed. He was 79 at the time of the interview, 25 when mom and dad were lost. And what he told us was he gained enough from his mom and dad the first 25 years of his life to be able to learn how to lead a successful life for the rest of his life. And he said, yeah, it was painful that I lost my mom and dad. I still have trouble with funerals. When people die, I break down and cry. I can't help it. You know, and I'm thinking, well, me too. But I haven't lost my mom and dad. But what was amazing about him was his resilience. It was his positive attitude, his success that he'd had in life. And he was so proud of his family. He was such a wonderful interview.
Well, that's because he'd been saving it up just for you.
I guess, because he didn't tell anybody else about it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, seriously, that's such a tribute to his parents.
Everybody that we talked to who knew who his mom and dad were said nobody said a bad word about him.
Well, he's a walking tribute to them. I mean,
yeah, he was amazing.
That's awesome. Was he your favorite interview? I mean, I know you can't really say, oh, this was my favorite.
You know,
one of them.
I really enjoyed my interview with him. I really enjoyed the interview with Denny Bellamy. Was hilarious. I mean, it was really, really fun.
Yeah.
And I mean, he told us that as a child, the day that the Silver Bridge collapsed, his mom wanted him to go shopping with his dad in Gallipolis, Ohio, which was the other side of the bridge. Mm-hmm. And he didn't want to. So he ran up a tree. He climbed up a tree and he hid up in this tree. And he didn't have any idea what happened with the bridge, but his mom, he saw her walking down the street. And he said she was the type that would tell his friends to cut a switch from a tree, and then she'd come and smack him with it, you know, and he used a little bit more pointed language than that, but I'm not going to do that.
Oh, I've had to pick my own switch. I'm Southern. It happens.
He said that the Silver Bridge collapse saved him from getting his butt beat all the way up and down the street by his mom, because by the time he saw his mom, she had tears in her eyes.
She thought he was gone.
Well, and he thought she was mad, and she was so mad she was crying, but she was mortified because she thought he had drowned in the Silver Bridge disaster. So, you know, he brought a light of humor to it, and he was just a wonderful interview. So I had a lot of fun with him too. We enjoyed all the interviews. One of my favorites was Linda Lane. She was the third interview, and Linda had some of the most profound things that she revealed. She didn't even remember until we went into the interview, because we were talking about, she was an 18-year-old girl and she had just gotten off work and she was heading towards the Silver Bridge to go over the bridge to go home to Gallipolis, Ohio, where she lived. And all of a sudden she pulls up to the bridge and the bridge is not there.
Holy
And
wow.
they found out a few days later that her sister-in-law drowned in the bridge disaster. So Linda, I said to her, I said, if I'm you, I'm 18 years old. It's the weekend. Work is over. It's Friday night. I'm driving home. I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to be doing for the weekend. And all of a sudden I pull up on the bridge and the bridge is gone. And then it doesn't make sense to me because my
Right.
eyes must be playing
Yeah.
tricks on me. And then slowly I start kind of coming to and realizing what happened. The bridge collapsed. She said, now that you put it that way, she said, a couple days after the bridge went down, I was at home. And the next thing I knew, I was in bed and I woke up and I said, where am I? And turned out she had passed out. She was in shock. I think it was after they had learned that her sister-in-law had died, and she collapsed and she actually coded. She died.
Oh my gosh.
And they got her in the car and they drove her to the hospital, and she kept on passing out, but she had buried this psychologically and she'd forgotten about it. But it wasn't until we were kind of recounting the whole experience and asking her, this is what I'm hearing and this is what I'm thinking if I'm you, that came out through our conversation. And it
That's
was just,
so
it was amazing.
intense.
It was amazing.
Well, when that was coming out, was she letting it go? I mean, was this a release for her?
Maybe to some degree. That was the first meeting we had with Linda. We've gotten to be friends with Linda since then. So we've seen her a couple, 3 times since we've been back to Point Pleasant since the interview. And we're on Facebook. We're friends on there and we bounce messages back and forth all the time. And Linda she was one of the people, she and Marva Bailey, when we interviewed folks, we did video and audio recordings. They didn't want the video going, which I respected that. We turned the cameras
Sure.
off. We just recorded their voices, and it was really just so we could transcribe the interviews. But Linda is the kind of person that when she's a little nervous, she laughs and she uses humor, I think, to cover a lot of things up. She's really pleasant. She's really funny. She's just a really cool lady. But I think it was cathartic for her. I think bringing that out, because if it was buried for years,
Yeah.
I think it was probably very helpful to her.
It was time to let that go. People don't realize, I think, that what is the post-traumatic stress? You are searching for post-traumatic positives and finding them, but her post-traumatic stress almost killed her.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think people necessarily realize how intense and powerful that can be. I mean,
Yes.
I'm so glad that she survived hers. I mean, that could have gone either way.
When Grant and I were talking on Sunday night, one of the things that really connected with him was that we're looking for our next project to be really more general than the first one was, because the first one was about Point Pleasant and the Silver Bridge, Mothman and the UFOs. This one is about the relationship between trauma and paranormal activity, but again, focusing on the positive things that come from those experiences. And as we were talking about trauma maybe being a gateway to paranormal activity, he said, absolutely it is. He said, it opens you up. And he said, anything that can shut down the left brain opens us up to the right brain so that we can be connected with all that is. Because the left brain's always looking for answers, but it's doing it analytically. It's doing it, with numbers. It's doing it according to paradigms and understandings that we already have, and comparing knowledge to new knowledge and seeing if things fit in, square pegs into round holes or what have you. But when you shut that left brain down, which trauma will do, we talked about the imprinting that happens psychologically. I mean, we talked about how you never forget where you were when you heard about 9/11. When the Twin Towers went down, I can tell you exactly where I was. I can tell you who I talked to. I can tell you about the TV in the break room that we watched as the second one went down. And you just don't forget that because it was so traumatic and so frightening that it just imprints on your mind. It shuts the analytics down, and all of a sudden you're open to extreme possibilities like that really was.
Yes. I think that's interesting, and we're going to have to go to break, but I want to continue to revisit this because I agree with you that this is just way too many things that happen as a result of stress of that nature. So we'll be back. Y'all come back too. And thank you for being here. We'll be right back with Bill Kousoulas, Dr. Bill Kousoulas. Maybe we're not going to break.
I'm still here.
I'm still here too. So we are going to, I may have taken my producer by surprise because that's the way that goes sometimes. But until I see something that says, you got to do this, then I'm not going to worry about it. We'll just continue.
I'm so sorry. I'm back here, you guys. I'm pushing this button like a madman, and my mouse battery's died.
This is my producer, everybody. This is Race Hobbs.
I am so sorry. Here we go, you guys. I got it. Here we go.
Okay, we'll be back.
Hey, UFO conference enthusiasts. We've got another great event for you in 2024. The Saucers and Aliens Kansas UFO Day in Dimension G is being held in the UFO capital of Kansas, Geneseo, on July 6th. This is a fun festival in the middle of nowhere. There will be a parade, decorated yards, costumes, vendors, speakers, and a showing of the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still. Appropriately, an 8-foot-tall statue of Gort and a statue of Klaatu will be dedicated. This will be the only museum in the U.S. with these custom-made statues. If you'd like to donate to the statue project or attend the event, visit GeneseoMuseum.com. That's GENESEO Museum.com. Be sure to bring your camera when you attend the event. That's GeneseoMuseum.com.
The UNX Network presents a health and wellness spiritually based brand of hemp-derived CBD products made by Hopewell Farm in Harrogate, Tennessee. We apply our Cathara energy work with all of our plants and products. Our products made in small batches with only 2 ingredients of pure hemp, full-spectrum crude oil, and coconut-derived MCT oil. Third-party lab tested for potency and legal THC levels with 6 strengths of 1 ounce oil to choose from. Know what you're buying and get what you pay for from Hopewell Farm. Applied directly to a specific area, Hopewell Farm topical salve in 1 ounce and ½ ounce sizes made with pure hemp crude oil, comfrey extract, and all natural ingredients. Find the Hopewell Farm link and coupon code on the UNX Network website at unxnetwork.com. That's unxnetwork.com.
This is Margie Kay, and I'd like to say thank you to all of our KUNX show hosts, staff, listeners, and viewers for making us number 1 on Paranormal Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Paranormal Experience with Kat Hobson. That's me. And I am joined by someone that I'm enjoying a lot, Bill Kousoulas. And he wrote the book, Bridging the Tragedy. And I'm trying to get Silver Linings in the Mysterious Ohio River Valley. And it's an illustrated book. So, Bill, welcome back.
Hi again, Kat.
Hey again. You know, we had talked about paranormal experiences and how people cope with them, where the reactions versus, putting them off to the side come from. And in your book, you discussed that there were all kinds of anomalous things happening in that area. You were having cryptids, you were having Mothman, you were having spiritual or ghost interaction. And this was getting pretty prevalent and then just completely gone after the collapse. What were some of the experiences that people were having based on your interviews? And well, let's just start there.
Sure.
I mean,
Well,
I know about the Mothman stuff, but our guests may not, our listeners may not.
so the Mothman Prophecies was a book written by John Keel, released in 1975. And it begat the movie The Mothman Prophecies, starring Richard Gere and Laura Linney, in 2002. And as the story was told, basically, John Keel, who was a full-time ufologist, was trying to put together the definitive article for Playboy magazine on UFOs. But as he began writing, anybody who's familiar with his writing is the guy just goes off the deep end.
Yeah.
Talk about a researcher. He was so far ahead of his time. He wrote so much for the Playboy magazine that they said, John, this is too much. This is too big. We can't put this into one of our magazines. So they kind of severed ties. And he wrote the book and published it in 1970 called Operation Trojan Horse. So by then he was full-time in the field. He was researching, he was traveling, he was writing. And through his travels, he had heard a story that there was a young kid, a teenager, who had found a cat, and this cat had wings on its back. And so he was in West Virginia, and he called it Thomas the Cat. And so this boy took Thomas the Cat, and he opened up like a little booth here and there, and for 5 cents, you could come take a look at his cat with wings. And as this was going on, Keel got wind of the story, and he wanted to go meet this guy and see this cat with wings. But a lady claimed that this was her cat, and she took this boy to court to sue him to get the cat back. In the process, the cat ended up losing its wings, and the kid lost his revenue source, and John Keel ended up in West Virginia. And being in West Virginia, he got wind of these sightings that were happening in and around Point Pleasant. And the sightings, as they were, the very first sighting of what was come to be called Mothman in Point Pleasant happened on November the 15th of 1967.
Yes.
Two married couples who were teenagers, but married, were driving around in a 1957 Chevy in the TNT area, which is about 11 miles outside of Point Pleasant. And all of a sudden, cruising up and down this Lover's Lane type place, which used to be a munitions factory for the World War II effort. They had all these different concrete domes that basically held TNT in the area, hence the name, the TNT area. They're driving through here at night, and all of a sudden they got a glimpse of this black winged figure with these piercing red eyes. It scared them half to death.
Yeah.
So they hightailed it back to Point Pleasant, going up and down, basically down the Ohio River. And it's a really twisty, turning type of a road. And they said they hit speeds of 100 miles an hour. Now, we've been out that way many times at night, and I typically don't even go over 50 miles an hour because it's just that treacherous. And they made it all the way back into town. Pardon me?
I guess it depends on your fear factor.
Yeah.
Your motivation.
That too. So they got to town and they gave reports to the police office, and the police officers took the 4 kids and they separated them into different rooms to find out if they were making this up. And they were very credible. Their stories all lined up. and they wrote them all out. And basically the police believed that they had seen something. They didn't know what it was. But that was the beginning of what we call the Mothman flap of Point Pleasant. During the next 13 months to the date, there were reports of UFOs. In fact, there were as many reports of UFOs, if not more, than there were of Mothman. Beautiful lights in the sky.
Yeah.
Carolyn Harris told us that they were the most beautiful lights she had ever seen. She had told us that she never did see a flying saucer, but one did land in her brother's backyard. So there were those.
Wow.
There were disembodied voices. People were getting mysterious phone calls with voices they couldn't really understand. A lot of the times what they would hear was a combination of what sounded like either Spanish or German, and it was kind of babbly in like a sing-song type of a tone. People couldn't really make sense of it, but people were having prophetic dreams. There were dreams of presence floating on water, and all kinds of strange things were happening. Poltergeist activity, cattle mutilations were happening. There were bodies
I had not heard about cattle mutilation.
Cattle mutilations as well. Missing dogs, that happened as well. My girls are both sleeping here now, so hopefully they didn't hear me say that. But I mean, you name it. It was like Skinwalker Ranch,
Right.
but 50 years before.
That's intense.
Yeah, it really, really is. And the community was really scared. I mean, they felt like they were under siege, and all these different reports were coming in. Jeff Wamsley told us that there were at least 100 reports, between 100 and 200 reports of people having sightings. And that was probably just the tip of the iceberg, because people don't really want to make reports about this stuff because they don't want other people thinking they're crazy. And keep in mind, this is a very conservative Bible Belt type of region where people don't want to go making stuff up. I mean, these are church-going people. They weren't big drinkers. They were responsible workers. But it was really an area under siege for 13 months.
That's unimaginable. And, you know, with today's social media and everything that's going on now, you could see that happening. But in that time period, no. It would be so difficult to get people together to be coming up with these things.
Mm-hmm.
And
some of these people would report anonymously, but a lot of them gave their names. They weren't afraid to give their names. And this is, again, a very conservative area. Nobody wants to be seen as being crazy, but they went on record and said, hey, this is what I saw.
Crazy. And not only that, but we're talking landlines where hearing conversations over their phones would not be normal either.
Right.
I mean, although I have had, like back in the day, I've had landlines kind of like get crossed from where whoever had this house before had so many lines coming in for faxes, phones, other things that the wires were crazy. And there was a problem here, but not for long because I quit using a landline. So
we haven't had one for several years now.
No,
one thing
me either.
I didn't mention, Kat, that there was a lot of Men in Black type activity also.
Tell me about that.
So in the Mothman prophecies, Mary Heyer, who assisted John Keel in his investigations, was in her office in the early stages of the book. And this was after the bridge had collapsed. And a man came into the office. He had Coke bottle bottom type glasses on, a fedora hat, and he was about 4 feet 6 inches tall. Really, really creepy. And he was asking Mary about John Keel and asking her about, what was going on with the UFOs and where is John Keel and all this type of stuff. And as he was talking to her, he kept getting closer and closer and closer to her desk. And his eyes had almost a hypnotic type effect. And she didn't realize that he had closed the gap between where he was standing before, and he was practically right in her face. And that just really, really kind of scared her. There was that. Carolyn Harris told us that there were Men in Black who they just knew were from the government, and she had this really cute accent. She called them government men. So we just figured they were government men. She said, but
Yeah.
then there were these others, and they didn't look like they were from around here. And she didn't really describe what that meant, and she kind of left it open to our interpretation, but it sounded like they could be foreign or they could be otherworldly.
Mhm.
Like maybe they were entities from a different realm. So that was happening as well too. And there's one really frightening episode that happens in the Mothman prophecies. Mary Hyer's niece was a lady by the name of Connie Carpenter. Connie was 18 years old, and she saw a Mothman in the broad daylight on the way home from church on a Sunday. And within a couple of days, she was walking home, and a guy pulled up in a car, and it was a late model car, but maybe 10 years old, but it looked like it had just rolled right off the showroom floor. And he pulled up and began asking her for directions. And as she leaned in, he grabbed her arm and tried to pull her into the car. She was able to break free, and she hightailed it into her apartment, locked the door. And the next day, there was a note that was slid underneath the door that said, "You better be careful, girl. I can get you yet." So there was all kinds of intimidation that was going on. These men in black seemed to be trying to shut down people who were talking about Mothman, talking about UFOs. They didn't want word getting out. And there was some question as to whether they were really government agents or spooks, or if they were even otherworldly entities. So really, really just fascinating and scary stuff.
Well, that is. And I know that Gray Barker, right, had written also about this. And one of the things that I always have been so fascinated by is the fact that the way these men in black portray themselves. I mean, they're blatant. And I have a friend who was a man in black on an incident, an acquaintance. And when I found that out, I was just kind of like, really? Because I'm like, I'm going to be doing a lecture, before long, and I'd really like to include this. Can you give me some more information about it? And he was like, oh, I cannot, because I was kidding. Ha ha. You know, and I'm like, whatever. You are not kidding. But you know, and that was outside of Pensacola. So, it's just kind of like, no, these are real people. They're real humans, for the most part. And then you get like the guys, was it the hotel in Switzerland where they did not look at all human in the photographs that were from the security section? There's so much to that. And I can't even imagine how that poor woman felt getting that note into her home.
And she is one that never, ever, ever talks about it. She would not grant interviews. Her husband, Keith, is interviewed in the DVD version of the Mothman Prophecies. There's a special edition that has a second disc, and it kind of gives some of the background to the whole Mothman legend. And Keith Carpenter is in there, and he talks a little bit about some of Connie's experiences, but she will not do it at all. She will not talk about it for anything.
Is it because she's afraid they'll still come after her?
I think that's part of it. I think she's still really traumatized by what happened to her all those years ago.
I can certainly understand that.
There's in the initial Mothman, as the saga began, we talked about the two young couples that were driving through the TNT area. That was Roger and Linda Scarberry.
Yeah.
And Steve and Mary Millette. Now, Roger and Linda divorced shortly after the whole Mothman saga, and Roger left town and never came back.
Yeah.
And Linda was interviewed in all kinds of different documentaries and such, but she ended up dying at a young age. And a lot of it, I think, was trying to mask a lot of the trauma she went through. And the way Denny Bellamy described it in his interview with us was that they just crushed the life out of her.
Yeah.
meaning the powers that be that tried to shut her down. They made her look like she was crazy, and she just really was ostracized in society. And she ended up passing away in her 50s due to different complications. But the Mallets still live in Point Pleasant. In fact, when I was in town in 2019, one of my friends has relatives in Point Pleasant, and he traveled with me the one year Jackie couldn't come with because she had a work commitment. And this guy was taking us around, the TNT area and showing us different things that I'd seen before, but Mike hadn't. And then he said, "That's where the Mallets live, right there. Let's just go to their house and go talk to them." And I said, "I'm not going to go to their house and knock on their door because they don't want to be interviewed either. And I'm
Right.
not going to violate their privacy. As much as I would love to meet them and
Right.
talk to them, I respect the fact that they don't want to talk about it, and I left them alone. But boy, I would love to have a conversation with them."
No doubt. Me too. If you get if you get in the door, let me know.
I will let you know.
But something that one of the most laughable explanations for the Mothman that it just flew all over me. My dad was Green Beret Special Forces Airborne Division. Okay. I watched my dad jump out of perfectly good airplanes all of my young life, until I was in high school. And, I'm just like, in fact, the first time I ever saw a UFO, it was over our apartment, and a bunch of he and his comrades in arms were cooking out. And I'm like, "What is that? It's not moving and there's no noise." And they're like, "Oh, that's a helicopter." I was like, "I've seen you jump out of helicopters. That's not a helicopter. I know better." So, one of the things that got me with the Mothman was when they're trying to say, "Oh, well, it's the image with the big collar turned up like Count Dracula with the head, and that's a parachute." I'm like, "No, that is not a parachute." I mean, they were coming up with all kinds of crapola explanations for this. And I don't even know how those people who were experiencing this did not just go off on the government, although I can understand not going off on the government. But I mean, there were so many different ways that people were being just jacked around with this.
Well, and Barred Owl was one description,
Barnett, oh, please.
and Sandhill
Yeah.
Crane was another one. And I have heard that there was a military operation that was going on around that time too, where Green Berets were actually diving into the area around Point Pleasant. So I've heard that one actually sounds a little bit more plausible than the first two.
Certainly more than a sandhill crane. They are skinny and stand on one leg.
Right.
I mean, there's nothing that's going to be like, but seriously, a paratrooper, once you're on the ground, this isn't here. This part is is down behind you. It's not up, unless you're in a tree, which would be a whole different experience, right?
Yeah,
From
yeah.
somebody on the ground looking at you too. But there's and if they do have their parachute still up, they can't chase you. I mean, there's so many different things that on so many of these explanations just are bogus sounding from the get-go.
And even if they were paratroopers, even if they were Green Berets, even if that was happening, it still doesn't account for the rest of the phenomena that was going on.
No.
The disembodied voices, the phone calls, the prophetic messages, all the information that was coming in, the bridge collapsing as it did, all these different things happening at the same time. UFOs, Men in Black. I mean, come on. There was something going on there. There absolutely was
Big
something
time
going on there.
And then all of it stopped with the collapse of the bridge, right?
When we talked to Jeff Wamsley in his interview that's in our book, he talked about how the bridge collapsed, and it really took the focus off of all the anomalous activity that was going on, because now we have this real tangible catastrophe that's happened.
Yes.
It's
and a
Christmas
huge
time.
one.
We're burying loved ones. It's a community of 7,000 people if you count both sides of the river.
Yeah.
And we've lost 46 people in this disaster. So nobody wants to hear about that quote unquote nonsense now, because
Yep.
this is real. This is palpable. This hurts. We need to deal with this. So all the focus in the community went away from Mothman, UFOs, Men in Black, and focused on having burials and funerals and grieving and mourning and all these things that happen, and all the reclamation efforts of trying to pull all this stuff up out of the river, bodies, cars, bridge matter. I mean, you name it. So the focus totally changed. And I don't know that I've necessarily accounted for this before, but earlier in our conversation, we were talking about how paranormal activity seems to be a co-creation between us and psi-plasma, or the spiritual energy that's out there and such. Maybe what happened in Point Pleasant was, because people stopped focusing on all the anomalous stuff, it just dissipated. Or maybe it was still happening, but people weren't looking for it, because that's been said too. In fact, there is a Small Town Monsters documentary called The
Yes.
Mothman Legacy. And then The
Yes.
Mothman Legacy, Jeff Wamsley and the rest of the folks who are in that documentary talk about how there have been sightings in West Virginia, in Point Pleasant, of Mothman, not just in the 60s, but also in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the 2000s. They still take place, just not with the same concentration as they did in 66 and 67, even though we have all this media now. It's just not nearly as
Yes.
prevalent.
Well, that would lead you to conclude that either there's not so many of them, or they've gone to ground somehow, if
And
they're still there.
one of the things too that I've heard is maybe one of the reasons we don't see all this stuff is that so many of us are glued to our cell phones all the time now.
Screens,
Yeah, we're not looking up, we're looking down. So we're not looking
which is
outwards.
which is going to make us have weirdly shaped necks and shoulders and
Yep.
future generations after a
Yep.
while. But until they learn how to put them over our eyes so that we don't see anything that's going to be alarming, right?
Mm.
But I just cannot fathom. I've seen some weird stuff, and I'm sure you have too. But I just cannot fathom something that's going to chase you like that, that's not a ground-based cryptid. I mean, that was some speed that these people, even if they were exaggerating, to be running with a car
Mm-hmm.
is astounding. There are very few even known, air quotes, known cryptids that would be capable of that. And no humans, unless, you've got Usain Bolt over there doing a sprint race. But,
Mm-hmm.
it's not something that, even with all the technology that we have achieved to advance our athletes, would be possible.
One of the things I really respect about John Keel and his research was his hypothesis that Mothman could have been a thunderbird or a Garuda, which basically is the Eastern version or equivalent of what the native thunderbird is here in the United States. But he also used the term, and this is one of my favorite terms, transmogrification of energy, because
Right.
this being seemed to show itself to people along their belief systems or what they expected. If people believed in angels, they saw it as an angel. If they believed it was a demon, they saw it as a demon. If they believed it was, a thunderbird, like Tom Urey was a shoe salesman who actually really felt that it was just a big bird, just a great big bird that was following him. So, I mean, the different reports that came in, they were kind of similar, but they were all a little bit different from one another. Some talked about it having black countenance. Others talked about it looking more brown or more gray. So to me, it's really pretty indescribable. And I've kind of come to believe that whatever the Mothman was, it was more of an spiritual or an energetic being, more so than a terrestrial or land-based cryptid. I mean, I really think it's something that's more advanced than we can even really comprehend. And I think it presents itself to people in different ways.
And how they would expect it to.
Right. Again, back to expectations,
Yeah.
like we talked about earlier.
Mhm. You know, it's interesting that you brought up a Thunderbird, because I have a friend who is in South Carolina who is a Native American. And I was out on my deck one afternoon this morning, and I saw a shadow flying. I mean, the the wingspan was monumental. It was astounding. And so I'm looking behind me for what's casting this shadow, right? Because I'm getting my dogs in the house. I'm calling them as I'm looking, and there's nothing there. And I'm just like, there's no way that what was casting that shadow isn't visible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have a ton of trees in my backyard and around my house. And I was just like, no, what I was seeing was the shadow of something flying against the trees. And I picked up my phone, and because I was too late to get a picture, and I called my friend Lee, and I'm like, what is this? What is this? What would this be? And she was like, oh, that must have been my Thunderbird. I sent one to protect you. And I'm like, why would you send something to protect me? I
How
mean,
about that?
that's why when you said Thunderbird, I'm like, whoa. But that was a freaking huge shadow.
Hmm.
I don't have anything here that big. I live in the Southeast. We have all kinds of weird stuff. But I've seen an eagle fly. It was bigger than an eagle's shadow. So it was just like, well, I don't know what that was, but apparently my friend sent a Thunderbird to protect me from something that she perceived as a threat. And I was just kind of like, okay. So when you said that, that kind of rocked my socks, because that would be trippy, because if I saw something that was big enough to have cast that shadow in the dark around me that could somehow have been illuminated, that would be horrifying. It was
Mm-hmm.
pretty nerve-wracking when I'm trying to get my poor dogs gathered up and in the house, because I don't know what this is. It's got to be a predator. It's so big. But that's just wild.
It's interesting that you mentioned that he sent it as a protector, because Andy Colvin, who is somebody else we interviewed for the Bridging the Tragedy book, is a good friend of ours. And he is really probably the most prolific Mothman researcher on the face of the planet. He's repopularized John Keel's works by collecting them into volumes and publishing them as books for the last 15 years or so. But his hypothesis for Mothman was that he believes it's a benevolent protector deity that is really sent to kind of like level the playing field when it comes to cosmic wrongs that are being done on a mass scale. And he's
Yes.
very conspiratorial in his personal writing about the works that he's done. And he kind of reflects them back into the whole Mothman mythos, so to speak. But he really thinks that Mothman was sent to warn and to protect rather than to cause disaster or harm. And certainly, and I believe this too, I don't think Mothman had anything to do with causing the bridge to collapse whatsoever.
I would agree with that. I think that there were, I think that what happened was a completely separate thing. And when people are experiencing tragedy, sometimes they look for connotations to have something to blame it on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's in large part what happened.
Well, to make sense of tragedy, when things happen in our lives that don't seem fair, that certainly were not expected, we do look for causality. We try to find a reason for why these things happen. And it does make sense to say that, maybe this thing that was going on was evil and it was here to cause harm and to bring this bridge down and hurt this community. But I don't think that is at all what was happening. I think the two things were contemporaneous. They happened along the same timeline. And if there is a relationship, I think the relationship was whatever this being or these beings were trying to get the attention of the people who were there to try to avoid this mass casualty that happened. I'm more inclined to believe that, but that follows my paradigm of always looking for a silver lining in things too. And I'm aware of that.
Yes.
I'm aware of that.
Well, that would be a lovely resolution to that mystery, but there really isn't anything that anyone could have done, even with foreknowledge, to get people to not use that bridge.
And who would really pay attention to it? I mean, nobody was going to pay attention to that. In fact, one of the things we haven't really talked about are the prophecies that took place in the Mothman prophecy story. And towards the end of the book, John Keel is receiving information from anomalous sources. And Jay Perro was a radio personality in Babylon, New York. And she was like the original Kat Hobson. She was doing all these different talk shows and getting aliens and involving people that had paranormal experiences and such. And a lot of her studies had to do with the Mount Misery area of Long Island, where all kinds of weird stuff was happening. But she became connected to John Keel, who was also a New Yorker, and they would have conversations. And then all of a sudden, Jay's voice would change and Keel would hear somebody else talking. And she was either channeling different voices, other spiritual energies or entities or what have you, or she was literally handing the phone to somebody for them to talk to him. But he began getting information about things such as Dr. Martin Luther King is going to be assassinated. Bobby Kennedy is going to be assassinated. The Pope is going to be assassinated. 2 out of 3 of those people were assassinated, and the Pope wasn't, but it was because his assassin was stopped. So these are all things that kind of get lost in the mix when we talk about Mothman prophecies, because for the casual folks who are interested in Mothman, it's all about the cryptid or the perceived cryptid. But some of the weird stuff that went on in the background was this information that Keel got. And like the movie, he thought that a chemical plant was going to explode based upon some of the information he got. He never put 2 and 2 together and realized that the disaster that was going to happen on the Ohio River was the Silver Bridge collapse. He thought it was a chemical plant that was going to explode that was located on the banks of the river. So, yeah, I mean, that information that he received, it was just astounding the way that it was accurate. But the entities were never exactly dead on with what was going to happen. In fact, they had told him that King was going to be assassinated on February 4th. Well, he was killed on April 4th, but it still happened. And Keel tried to get a hold of Dr. King's people, but nobody wanted to hear it. They thought he was crazy. They didn't want anything to do with where he was coming from.
Which is tragedy in itself.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that could have been avoided.
You would hope. I mean, and the bad part of now is that nobody learned from these things. This is still, if you were to pick up the phone and call somebody's handlers, public figures handlers, and say, I have foreknowledge that's off the wall, but this is being given from some source somewhere that this is going to happen at or around this date. You need to be watching your principal. People would call to have you put away.
Mm-hmm.
And then if something did happen, you would be investigated and potentially charged for having that knowledge.
Right.
It's like people don't learn, and they know psychics are real. Our government uses them.
Mm-hmm.
And yet they still don't put stock into what's happening with that. Although they know and they have tested enough. I mean, how many programs have there been, right? Where prophecy has been proven, where psychics and, different other methods of anomalous information gathering have been tested, used. We had a psychic that found a submarine in the woods in Russia, where it was being built. It's just amazing to me that 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 gets blown off.
Closer to home, along those same lines, in the 1970s, in my dad's second marriage, his sister-in-law, Geraldine, we live in Sycamore, Illinois, and that's about 60 miles outside of Chicago. But Geraldine, really sweet lady, she got married to a man. They moved up to Minnesota, and she went missing sometime within that first year they were in Minnesota. And she never was found alive again, but she was missing for a long, long time. And they, had all kinds of people searching for her. And they finally engaged with a psychic who said, you will find her by a body of water. And sure enough, they found her body by a body of water. So that was probably the very first instance of a psychic being involved with identifying, a lost loved one in my life.
Right.
That had actually taken place. And at that time, I would have probably been 10 or maybe 12 years old when this all happened. Right. So to be exposed to that at such a young age and find out that people have these extrasensory perception type abilities to be able to do this was just astounding.
It blows my mind all the time. And, I do have some abilities and I do use them when I get information. But I have friends who are the most astounding psychics. One of them had a show on MTV's at some point. She's very good at finding lost humans. And she sees through the victim's eyes. She has a friend who is similar to her in abilities who sees through the perpetrator's eyes. And I'm like, oh, no. No, thank you, though. I can't even imagine that. But there would have to be some degree of that with the woman that you were talking about because they're seeing where she is. So that could have been coming from either side of that.
Yeah, I never thought of that before, but that's entirely possible. Maybe she was viewing through the perpetrator's eyes.
Could be. I mean, I didn't think about that being a thing until I was talking to my friend and she actually channeled, remote viewed through me on an investigation I was on because I knew something was there. I couldn't find it. It had to go. And so she was like, I called her and I was like, I need help with this. I can't do it. And she was like, you just go. And so she saw through me. And it was really funny because I was very nervous about that. So we're standing in this living room and she's like, you have got to slow your heart rate down. You're going to have a heart attack and we'll both be in trouble. I'm like, this is just so weird. So weird. And so I opened a door because I knew where it was. I just couldn't see it, And so as I got closer to the room, I'm getting more tense. And she said, open the closet. I said, I don't think so. If you think it's in there, you go get it. She said, I am. Open the door. But, that's when I started thinking, if she's seeing through me, can people see the other way? And that's when she told me, yes, because I said, do you see it through the victim or the perpetrator? She said, I see it through the victim. That's how I know who did it. And, but I have a friend that sees it through the killer's eyes. So that was trippy.
We, probably the most profound psychic that I know is interviewed in our book. And her name is Harriet Plumbrook, which is a pseudonym. Yeah. But she was, she grew up in the same neighborhood that Andy Colvin did in the 60s in Charleston, West Virginia. And she had a UFO / missing time incident.
Mhm.
And when she came out of that missing time incident, she had the Agent Scully marks on the back of her neck, the two little
Whoa.
things in the back of her
Yes.
neck, and she developed profound psychic ability. And she was just 8 or 9 years old at the time. But when we met Harriet, we were doing a Zoom meeting with Harriet and Andy at the same time. And we started having a conversation with the both of them. And Harriet said, "You've got some health issues." And I said, "Yeah, I've got some trouble with my back." She said, "No, I'm seeing something else like diverticulitis." Well, I had been misdiagnosed with diverticulitis a year or two before that. So I didn't think that she was on about that. 2 days later, I took my first ambulance ride to the hospital with something that was related to gastrointestinal stuff that I didn't even know that I had going on. So that was my first big aha moment with Harriet. Next, when in 2021, we went to Point Pleasant and we conducted those interviews I was telling you about. We did a Zoom meeting. We drove from Point Pleasant to Charleston, which is about a 50-mile shot, right up the Kanawha River, which is one of the two rivers that intersects in Point Pleasant. And we drove up to where Andy and Harriet grew up. And we did our second spirit box session there. We had done one a year before, scared the Jesus out of us, so we just left. But we did the
Why?
second one.
Okay, you're going to have to come back there.
I will come back there. But we did it. We did a spirit box session with Jaci and me and a friend of ours with us in the car. And then we had Andy and Andy's son Gibson and Harriet on a Zoom meeting on my iPad or my phone, one of the two. And as we were sitting in the area, I started getting the sensation, like an electrical sensation around the third eye crown chakra type area, like a pleasant electrical sensation, like I was being pulled up out of my head. That's what it felt like. And we had that same experience the year before, and I will return to the year before also. But during this session, Jaci had the headphones on and had her eyes kind of blacked out. So she was totally sensory deprived, at least visually and audio wise. And I was asking questions, and Andy and Harriet were asking questions, and Jaci was listening, and she was just responding as best she could. And at one point, I started having chest pains, and I'm pretty healthy except for some of the back trouble I have. And I was telling Harriet, I said, I'm having chest pains. She said, somebody had a heart attack. Somebody in the area had a heart attack, and this is the way they're communicating with you, that they had the heart attack. And then as the session went on, and we were having a blast. It was just a lot of fun.
Right.
I'm thinking I'm going to have a heart attack, but I'm hoping I'm not. I'm still having. Well, then all of a sudden, Jaci takes the headphones and throws them off and takes the blindfold off. And she's like, "What are you doing? Why are you shaking the car?" And we looked at her. We're like, "What are you talking about?" She said, "You didn't feel that?" She said, "The whole car was shaking." And Harriet said, "They're fighting to come through you." That's what it is. So whatever entities we were channeling through the spirit box were fighting to try to come out.
Oh my goodness.
Jaci. So that part, it was such an enlightening thing. And we actually have it on our YouTube channel where we've got the whole session recorded.
I will have to go and look at that. That would be awesome.
I'll get it for you. If I can send it to you, I will.
Thank you.
But to go back the year before that, so we went to this area. It's called Bird Mountain, where Andy and Harriet grew up. And we didn't really know them yet at this point because this was 2020. And we weren't even really phenomenology research professionals at that point. We were just having fun, taking adventures. And so we went to this area, and Andy was sending us messages on Facebook Messenger, go here, make a left there, go here. So we ended up, there was a church, and we pulled into the church, and we figured this is a safe place. Let's do a ghost box session here. So Jaci and I both we were just asking questions, and the lady that was with us in the back seat had the apparatus on, and she was doing the channeling or what have you. And so we're asking questions, and the lady in the car says to our friend, says, "Behind us." And we looked back, and there was a man who was kind of behind us on his porch. And then she said a woman, and there was a woman behind us on the other side. And she kept on, like, they were like direct hits to our questions, and it was getting kind of weird. And we only did this for like 5 minutes. But then at one point I said, "Should we leave?" And then there was a quiet for a minute, and she says, undeniable. So we turned the car on and got the hell out of there.
No doubt.
That was the session that I was telling you about. But we also, all three of us had that sensation of being lifted up from the crown chakra and from the third eye area. It was a pleasant electrical sensation. But Harriet told us, she said, don't let them take you. She made that comment to us. And then as we found out, Andy has done a lot of writing in his books. Mothman Speaks, Mothman Shrieks, and Mothman Squeaks. These are the names of the books he's written. I know it's funny, but
It is.
he had said that where we were at, right across the street from where we were in this church parking lot, was where a schoolhouse was back in, I think, the 50s or the 60s. And it
Okay.
was burned down, and there were children that were in it that were killed. And the person who did this was none other than Charles Manson. So
Get out of town.
Charles Manson and Sarah Jane Moore, who was the lady who tried to assassinate
Yes.
President Ford back in the 70s,
Yes.
both grew up in that neighborhood. They were pals. I don't think they were boyfriend, girlfriend, but they would be like walking up and down the street together, holding hands and hanging out and causing mischief.
That is bizarre.
Isn't that crazy?
Yes. Oh my God, the energy that must have been around that school, the school grounds.
It is unbelievable. That energy is palpable.
Yes.
Harriet
Any place
she calls it creepy central.
Yeah. Any place where you have children harmed has so much. I mean, it's not just their energy, it's the energy of everything that was trying to save them too.
And that really was the impetus for the book that we're working on right now, because I had learned years ago, or I at least received information, I don't remember where it even came from, that when a child is harmed, that is the gateway to the demonic.
Yeah.
All the energy that can open up there, or to the paranormal. It doesn't have to be the demonic. I'm using that as like a catchphrase, but trauma and paranormal activity, I really believe, are related, and we're setting
I
out
agree.
to try to find that relationship.
There's a place in Key West that is an old theater, and it's right next to the house where Robert the Doll originally lived, on Eaton Street. But I thought this was a load of hockey until I actually experienced it myself. If you go, and you don't have to do anything, you don't have to do anything at all except just listen. Yeah, you can put a hand on the door, you can just listen. And if you give it a few, you will hear screaming and running footsteps of there was a fire in there. And the youth choir, the children's choir was practicing for a program. And somebody had locked the front doors and they couldn't get out.
Aww.
And you can hear that happen. And, I'm so skeptical of stuff like that. I'm like, okay, I need somebody to go around to the back. And, but it was, Key West is definitely key weird. And I went there until I got hurt for right at 20 years every year. And it was Twilight Zone, that moment was, because you could feel the warmth on the door too. And we would go in November. It was not generally warm, not like that kind of warm.
Mm-hmm.
But so I seriously believe that that's true, that there is any place anybody has harmed a child or an adult that never really developed past childhood, also that applies to.
Mm-hmm.
That you can't do that kind of ugly and not have some serious karmic and energetic repercussions for that.
Agreed. We've had some, and I know we're kind of running out of time now, but I'd like to
Had
share.
about 10 minutes.
I'd like to share a couple of things that have happened in our world.
Please.
I don't remember if the first time we were on with you, had I been hurt at that
Yes.
point?
Yes.
I had been. So since that time, and that was in January of last year, 2023, we had friends over to the house. And for people who haven't heard this, which is everybody except for you, I've had degenerative disc disease for years. And in my head, I'm 35, but I'm really not. So when we built our new house, we moved, we still have our townhome. It's just a mile down the road, but I did a lot of the heavy lifting myself. My brother and I moved the appliances and did all kinds of stuff. And long and short of it is I damaged my back. I have a herniated disc. I was hospitalized for a week. And when I came home, I had to relearn how to walk again.
Yeah.
So I have sciatica in the right leg now. The back is doing much better. And for people who don't know me, you don't even notice any difference in my gait or anything at this point. So it's not really that noticeable. I feel it, but you can't really tell otherwise. But Jaci has also had problems with her right knee and with her right leg. She's had trouble with that also, and her right foot. When I was home for just a couple of weeks, we had a couple come to the house, a guy that I went to high school with, and we hadn't seen each other for many years, but he bought a copy of Bridging the Tragedy and he wanted to discuss it. So he and his wife came to the house, and during their time here, I went to go use the restroom and was coming back out, and Maggie, our black lab, who was the more vocal of the two at the time, was in the bedroom with me, and she was just standing still and staring at me. And she wasn't barking, she wasn't talking, she wasn't doing anything, she wasn't moving. And when she started moving, she started limping on her right back leg. So we had a number of things happen with our right, legs. Maggie, Jackie, me, I think even Ellie, our other lab, the yellow lab, had some problems with hers too. And we worked with Harriet, and she kind of did a little bit of diagnosing what she thought may have happened. And also Margie K. We were in a conversation with Margie, and both of them had said that they had psychically seen that there was somebody who suffered an injury here on this property when it was farmland, and it was to the right leg. And so that seems to be kind of manifesting in our family here in this home here. I've never had a lot of paranormal experiences myself, really nothing to speak of until we moved in here. And I've seen a woman who looked like she was from around 1900 walking in our backyard. And then when I got up to go see who it was, they were gone. And so there was that also too. And Harriet has had a vision of like a white building on our property, and Jackie has had that too. And Jackie has some extrasensory abilities as well too. So those are some things we had happen here on this property. But the one thing I really want to share with you and with the audience is that, are you familiar with the TV show The Dead Files?
Yes, I've interviewed Steve DeShavy several times.
With Steve and with Amy.
Yes.
So they did an investigation about 35 miles from where we live, where the place is haunted now. And they hold haunted dinners where you can go in and they give you the history of what happened there, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole storyline is fascinating. And Jackie has like apps on her cell phone that work like as Oculus and pick up all kinds of different voices and, paranormal or different electronic voice phenomena, EVPs and such. So she was kind of walking around doing her thing, and I was eating dinner and just hanging out and visiting with people. And we noticed that the bartender, I was listening to her talking, and she had said that she lost her son in a car accident. And so as I was listening in, I heard her talk more and more about it. And she said, he comes home with me. He opens up all of my cupboard doors, kind of like in poltergeist fashion, where the chairs are all stacked up in the kitchen and all the cabinet doors are flung open. That kind of thing happens in her world there too. And so I approached her afterwards and asked her if she'd like to be part of our next book. And she said she would, and she gave me her contact information. And the next day, when we drove home, it's about 45 minutes to get back to our house. On the way back, we were listening to the Dead Files episode about that particular thing. I downloaded it when we were there, and we listened to it in the car on the way home. And Jackie said she blanked out almost the entire trip. And she's like, I didn't see this, I didn't see that. And all of a sudden we're here. What's going on? I'm like, I don't know. I've been here all along. I've been just driving. So the next day she says, I didn't tell you this, but I got voice hits on my phone. And one of them was this lady's name. I'm not going to mention her name, but her name is plain as day. Mom, where are you? And
Oh,
she claims that her boy's spirit follows her to work, follows her home, and does all these things. And then we got all this confirmation on the phone about it as well, too. So
wow.
there's absolutely something that's out there. And the fact that
Yes.
we're kind of keyed into it is mind blowing. To me, it's
I
mind
know, right?
Yeah.
I love this stuff. And I don't know what I would do if I didn't investigate it. I think that it's really it matters. Every time I get a piece of evidence, I'm just like, oh, look at that.
hmm
Right? It's just it's such a gift. It's
It really
is.
is, and we're both very positive, spiritual, religious type people. And I don't
Yes.
find any dichotomy between my belief system and the work that we do. We always have positive intention, and we ask and pray for protection whenever we do things like this. And whenever we do studies, it's always to seek the good, to help people to a
Absolutely.
higher vibration and a higher level of consciousness and understanding of who they are and what their place in the universe is and what it could be.
And to help them have closure.
That too.
I mean, that's one of the primary reasons that I don't do very many residentials, but when I do, that's why. If it's somebody that needs answers, if it's somebody that if they're afraid in their own home, I try to help them understand what's happening and help them because sometimes the fear is just simply from the unexpected and unusual and the connotation that it gets on these shows and stuff. You know, not everything that goes bang bang on your counters is somebody that's out to hurt you. Usually you're not going to have anybody focusing on you if it's not someone who loved you.
Mm-hmm.
And they're trying to get your attention. Mine do. So I have people show up here periodically and mess with my dogs or my husband who doesn't really he was such a firm I don't believe in this until he started experiencing things and he'll be like, "Can you please just tell them please just tell them that we're good?" Yeah, we'll calm that down.
We hear audibles in our house that I've called ghost barking.
Yes.
The dogs don't hear it, but we do.
I
And
have I have my former dogs here. They're not they'll always be my dogs, but I have dog spirits
I'm
here.
convinced that it's some of my girls' siblings who
Mhm.
didn't make it,
Yeah.
and they're just here to tell us that they're here.
Yeah. I mean, they loved us. They still do.
Mm-hmm.
And I lost my Kylie this year.
How
In
old
fact,
was she?
14.
I thought, yeah, 14 years old. That's an amazing lifespan.
I had her from 6 weeks and she developed diabetes and was blind and God, I love that girl. But we're out of time and I'm going on about dogs. But I'm so glad that you were here. Thank you.
It's been so nice visiting with you, Kat. Thanks so much for making the time for me and inviting me.
Ditto. Ditto. I enjoy you. I enjoy Jaci. We'll have to do this again when she is not working.
Absolutely.
So, and tell her I said hi and give her a hug for me.
I will.
And for all of our Race lost his baby too.
Oh,
About
sorry.
shortly after I lost Kylie. So
That's so
we
hard.
we went through that together. But and that was his baby. So everybody listening, if you have a fur baby, go love on them tonight. And thank you so much for listening because you can find Bridging the Tragedy, Bill's book, on Amazon. You can find it anywhere books are sold. And you really need to read this book. It's very interesting. And I was so surprised. But, you can You can get it. I love the Bridging the Tragedy, Silver Linings in the Mysterious Ohio River Valley. And silver linings are what Bill's all about. So
Thanks, Kat.
thank y'all again for listening, and we will see you next time. Same cat time, same cat channel. Good night.